Chapter 9, Emily and Fong Kwok. And so the little library grew. Mama sent away for Black Beauty, and Emily read it 3 times. Even though she did not think it was as good as Muriel said it was a sad book, but that part was all right. Emily enjoyed reading sad things. It was fun to cry over a book. Mama said wait till she got to Little Women. It was the way the horses chatted about their aches and pains that bothered Emily. Horses in Pitchfork neighed, whinnied, or nickered. They did not have long visits with each other about their troubles. Mama wrote, "A gift from Emily Bartlett" in the front of the book, and the Pitchfork Library had 1 more volume. It had, in fact, many more books, because Mama had bought them with the money from the Hard Times party. The rest of the money would be used to pay Pete Ginty to build some real library shelves. There was even some talk around Pitchfork that the next time there was an election, people might vote some money for the library. Right now, the trouble was that the library was outgrowing the corner of the commercial club rooms. But never mind. Mama would figure out something. Emily had faith. One morning in February, Emily was thinking about the library as she sat at the kitchen table with paper, crayons, mucilage, and a bunch of pussy willows she had picked up in pasture. Mucilage is glue. She was making a valentine for her cousin Muriel in Portland. First, Emily folded a piece of paper in half, cut out half a heart, opened the paper, and there was a whole heart. Then, with her brown crayon, she drew a fence across the middle of the heart. On the fence, she squeezed 3 dots of mucilage, or glue, and on each dot she pressed a fat pussy willow blossom, which are those fuzzy little flowering plants. With her black crayon, she drew ears and tails on the pussy willow blossoms. There! She had 3 furry kittens sitting on a fence. Kittens with fur you could really pet. The poem came next. This Emily printed in red crayon. "As long as new kittens mew, I love you. Guess who?" It was not as stirring as the poems Miss Plotkin made the class memorize in school. Things like, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." But it did rhyme, and that was something for a made-up poem. Emily finished the valentine with a red and yellow border. Mama dried her hands on a huck towel and came to admire Emily's work. "That is a very nice valentine," she said. Emily was pleased that Mama admired her valentine, but she still had her doubts. "I suppose Muriel is making valentines out of store-bought box," she said. She could picture Muriel working at her valentines in the city. She would be using little pieces of pleated paper to attach white paper lace to hearts already printed with roses and bluebirds. When Emily took Muriel's valentine out of the envelope, the lace would jump at her on its little paper springs. "I suppose so," agreed Mama, "but I think your valentine is much nicer." This was comforting. Mama knew about a lot of things, because she had gone to school in Chicago before she came out west to be a school teacher. Mama had even been to the opera. Reassured, Emily stuffed her valentine into the envelope and licked the flap. She would ask Uncle Avery at the post office to cancel the stamp by hand instead of cranking the envelope through the canceling machine, which might squash the pussy willow kittens. "You could go to the post office now," said Mama, "and stop at the store for a pound of coffee." Emily glanced out of the kitchen window. There were a few patches of blue in the gray sky. She would not have to take her umbrella, but she would have to wear her new rubbers, which had been one of her practical Christmas presents. When Emily reached the corner in front of the farm, she was faced with a choice: to go the long way to the left past the orchard, get her new rubbers muddy, and avoid passing Fong Kwok's house, or to go straight ahead the short way on the boardwalk past Fong Kwok's house and keep the shiny black newness on her rubbers. Emily loved new things. New boxes of crayons, new Montgomery Ward catalogs, new rubbers. Emily chose the short way. What if she did see Fong Kwok? Since the Hard Times party, Emily no longer worried about being laughed at. Everyone had laughed at her that night, and she had not minded a bit. In spite of her rubbers, which Mama had bought 2 sizes too large so she would be sure to get the wear out of them, Emily, her valentine clutched in one mittened hand, hippity-hopped along the board sidewalk, making a thumping noise whenever she hit a loose board. When she came to Von Quock's house, she saw the old man standing on the front porch, studying the weather. He saw her, and she saw him, so there was no walking past pretending she was looking up at a bird in a tree or anything like that. Emily's pioneer ancestors would not have been shy about passing Von Quock's house. Look at all the Indians they had not been afraid to pass as they journeyed across the plains. Emily slowed to a dignified walk, smiled, and bobbed her head. Von Quock smiled and bobbed his head back at her. Well, thought Emily, this is a good system, if we don't spend too much time in each other's company. Blithely, she went hippity-hopping on her way. At the post office, she explained about the pussy willow kittens to Uncle Avery, who was sorting the morning mail. Then she went into Grandpa's store. "Hello, Grandpa," she said. "Mom needs a pound of coffee." Grandpa was busy writing up a grocery order. "Go ahead and wait on yourself, Emily," he said. Emily was glad it was coffee she had come for, and not something easy, like a package of powdered sugar or a can of log cabin syrup. She hoped the old men who were sitting around the stove chewing tobacco and talking politics while they waited for Uncle Avery to sort the mail would notice her and think, "My, the way that girl measures coffee." Carefully, Emily weighed exactly 1 pound of coffee beans from the bin under the counter, not 1 bean more or 1 bean less, and then she dumped them into the red grinder and turned the handle that made the machine chew noisily and sprayed ground-up coffee into a container, which Emily emptied into a paper bag. How good it smelled. So far, none of the old men had paid any attention to her, which was a pity because she had snapped open the paper bag with such a flourish. But suddenly, Emily was paying attention to the old men. One of them was saying, "Did you hear that old Von Quock is going back to China?" "Yup," answered another old man, getting up to spit his tobacco juice into the stove. "That's what they say." Emily stared at the old men, waiting for them to say more about this astonishing piece of news. One of the men pulled out his big, round watch, opened it, and said, "Looks like it's about time for the mail to be out." And then all the old men got up and left the store. "Grandpa, is Von Quock really going back to China?" Emily asked. "So I hear," answered Grandpa, adding up the grocery order. China! Someone from Pitchfork, Oregon was going across the broad Pacific to China. "When is he going?" Emily wanted to know. "Soon as he can get his affairs straightened out," said Grandpa. "Is he going to stay there?" Emily asked. "I expect so," answered Grandpa. "A trip like that at his age." "How's he going to get there?" Emily asked. "I hear he's going to take the train to Frisco," said Grandpa. "From there he will take the boat." Well, this was exciting. A real world traveler in Pitchfork. Mama always said travel was a wonderful thing. Not that people in Pitchfork did not travel. When Uncle Avery was a soldier during the war, he traveled all the way across the United States to New Jersey, where he peeled potatoes. And one winter, before Daddy married Mama, he had a job guarding gold for Wells Fargo. He guarded it on the train all the way to San Francisco, and no bandits ever held up that train. Not with Daddy guarding the gold. And almost every day someone took the train to Portland. Emily had seen there herself several times, and the things she had seen! Streetcars, policemen, a dog wearing a little coat. Imagine a coat on a dog. Best of all, a restaurant where pats of butter were served on tiny doll's plates. But no one in Pitchfork had ever gone as far as China. Of course, a lot of people had come a long way to be in Pitchfork. Mama had come from back east, so had Grandpa and Grandma. And when Grandpa was a little boy, his mother and father had brought him all the way from England on a sailing vessel. And then there were the pioneer ancestors who had come from Missouri in their covered wagons. But no one ever went back. Once people came to Pitchfork, they stayed. And now Fong Kwok was going to China, and he wasn't coming back. Emily could hardly wait to tell someone such important news. The first person Emily met outside the post office was Pete Ginty, whose beard looked blacker and bushier than ever. "Hello there, Emily," said Pete Ginty. Emily simply had to tell someone the news. "Good morning, Mr. Ginty," she said politely. "Did you know Fong Kwok is going all the way back to China?" Pete Ginty leaned against the wall of the post office, hooked his thumbs in his belt, and looked at Emily. "So I hear," he said. "Fong told me so himself just a few minutes ago. Matter of fact, he was carrying a monkey wrench. Said he wanted to trade it for a girl about your age to take back to China with him." Emily did not know how to take this news. She looked at Pete Ginty. His eyes were not smiling. She could not tell about his mouth and all those whiskers. "What for?" she asked suspiciously. "Because he has only sons and grandsons in China," answered Pete Ginty. "Oh," was all Emily could say. Did he mean Fong Kwok wanted to trade her for a monkey wrench to take her back to China? My goodness, she didn't want to go to China. Go to China and leave Mama and Daddy and Grandpa and Grandma? I should say not. Probably Pete Ginty was trying to tease her. But if he was, he gave no sign. "Yep, told me so just a few minutes ago," said Pete Ginty. "Well, so long, Emily." "Goodbye, Mr. Ginty," said Emily faintly as she went into the post office. My goodness, what a terrible thought! To be traded for a monkey wrench? Surely this was all a joke, but Emily could not be sure. She recalled how Pete Ginty used to brag about how he could play the piano using only the black keys. Daddy said this was just some more Pete Ginty's humbug, until one day, when he came to the sitting room door to speak to Daddy about cutting some wood in the pasture, he stepped inside to the piano and played Uppity, all on the black keys. So now Emily did not know what to think, but she was sure about one thing. Mom and Daddy would never trade her for a monkey wrench or even a dozen monkey wrenches. But now what was she going to do? If she ran into Fong Kwok, he might ask her to go back to China with him. Even if he didn't, she might think he did, because he was so hard to understand. And what on earth would she say? If she said no thank you, I do not care to go to China, when he had not asked her, he would think her mighty strange. Clutching her coffee in her mitten-covered hands, Emily walked slowly down Main Street. The next person she came to was old George A. Barbie, whom she saw rather than met, because he was lying on his back under his Ford. Aye, this was certainly Emily's morning to run into Beards. "Good morning, Mr. Barbie," said Emily, bending over to peer at him. "Morning, Emily," answered the old man, looking out from under his car. There was a dab of grease on his gray beard. "Did you know Fong Kwok is going back to China?" asked Emily, still eager to share the exciting news. "So I hear." Old George A. tapped at his car with his wrench. Maybe Emily could find out something from old George A. I heard he wants to trade a monkey wrench for a girl about my age to take back to China," she ventured. Old George A. stuck his head out from under his car. "Pete Ginty tell you that?" he asked. "Yes," answered Emily. "Yes, he did." So it was true. Old George A. knew that Pete Ginty knew. Oh dear, now she really would have to avoid Fong Kwok. It was easy to see that the old man was too busy to talk, so Emily went on. When she came to the corner, she paused to make up her mind. The short way on the boardwalk to keep the new look on her rubbers, the long way past the orchard and through the mud to avoid passing Fong Kwok's house. This time Emily chose the long way. She could not expect to keep the new look on her rubbers forever. Gingerly, Emily stepped off the walk into the muddy road. Oozy mud the color of chocolate sucked at her rubbers. Walking was not easy, she soon discovered, because her rubbers were too big. If she lifted her feet too fast, her rubbers stuck in the mud. Emily walked carefully, lifting her toes out of the mud before her heels, so her rubbers would stay on. Mama would think she was never coming with the coffee. Once Emily forgot and lifted her heel first. Her foot came up and her rubber stayed in the mud. This was a problem. She had to hang on to the coffee, keep her coat out of the mud, and pull on her sticky rubber while balancing on one foot. It was quite a trick, especially since she was wearing mittens. After that, she kept her eyes on the road to find the places that looked the least muddy. When she came to the blacksmith shop, her friend Mr. Wilcox opened the door and called out, "Hello there, Emily. What do you think you're doing waiting in that mud?" Emily was embarrassed. "Going home. I've been to the store." Mr. Wilcox shook his head as if he could not understand Emily's behavior. "This is plain silly," Emily told herself sternly.